Hi, everyone, and welcome to the latest in the UK and a Changing Europe series of lunch hour events. Today, we are going to be discussing our newest report, which was a report on the social and political attitudes of Britain's minority ethnic population. And I'm delighted to say that the three people who lay behind this project, Sophie and Zane from our team, and James, who's disappeared, are all with us today. You can find the link to the report in the Slido. As always, if you have questions, and we hope to have a lot today, stick them in the Slido, vote for the ones you want me to post to the panel, and we can have a good debate about some of these really, really important issues that for too long, I think, have just gone under the radar in this country. But just to kick us off with a nice sort of starters of a 10, and I'll start with you, Zane. What if I was to say to you, what were the main takeaways of the report as far as you were concerned? What would you say?
Hi, Anand. Sure. So I think one of the main takeaways is that it's no longer really possible to speak about a labor monopoly over the ethnic minority vote. In particular, over the last couple of elections, we've seen Chinese and Indian voters increasingly turn to the Conservatives, and this is remaking the sort of party system in the UK, where you've got the Conservatives now increasingly the party of affluent ethnic minorities and working class whites, and Labour is the reverse image of more affluent educated whites and working class minorities. A second big takeaway, and we can discuss this in a little more detail, is the effects of education seem to interact or work differently for minorities and whites, particularly when it comes to social values and economic issues. Third, in terms of policy priorities, ethnic minorities and white voters largely share the same policy priorities. In the 2024 election, the reasons for not voting for the Conservatives were pretty similar. And so those are my main takeaways.
Brill. Okay, that's a really good start. Thank you, Zane. Sophie?
So it just follows on a bit from what Zane said at the end there, which was that even though obviously in this report we go in quite a lot to the differences between ethnic minority and white voters, and then again, kind of between ethnic minority voters and themselves. One of the things that really stands out is the similarities, I think, in terms of policy priorities, in terms of the style of government, the style of politician. That is attractive. And I think that's kind of become a bit more distinct from me from when we did the launch last week and we had a question about parties and the need to kind of make a distinctive appeal to ethnic minority voters from one of the audience members that we had there. And actually, really, what our data shows is there's not really such a thing as that necessarily. There might be issues that are of higher or lower salience to different groups of voters, but in terms of those priorities, in terms of how they view politics and their political values, there's actually quite a lot of broad similarities there. So that distinction, it kind of doesn't really exist.
Really interesting, isn't it? Because the report is a tale of really interesting similarities and differences. But James, what do you reckon? You can use your Lee Anderson, Rishi Sunak line, even though Zane's hinted at it.
No, it's okay. I think people have heard enough about that. I think what for those of you who don't know what Ananda's talking about, basically Zain has mentioned that the political dynamics that occur amongst minorities are different to those who are white, and that what draws you to the right is different. So, for example, if you're higher income, higher education, you're more likely to shift to the right if you're a minority, and the opposite is true as if you're white. So what that leads to is the left and the right having awkward coalitions. So on the right, that's the Rishi Sunak Lee Anderson axis, which people commented on as a slightly kind of comical span intellectually and politically, but actually it's not a bug, it's a feature of the system. And Labour actually, to the same degree, have the inverse issue. But for me, the most interesting thing is really whether in 10 years' time, it would make sense to do a report like this again. And actually, I'm not entirely sure because I think the whole point of the work that Zane and Sophie and myself have done is basically there's been a massive fragmentation, and actually it's getting harder and harder to find any commonalities or similarities between different minority groups. For many people, that's obvious. But I think it's worth stating that was definitely not the case 20 or 25 years ago, where there were more similarities in terms of voting patterns and how people behaved and what their values were. So, and what I would say is that the international context, which is, I think this is a global phenomenon. This across other English-speaking democracies, Zayn, I don't know if he's interested in talking about his experience as a Canadian, but very similar situation going on in Canada and America, where we see minority groups very strongly fragmenting. So if you're American, increasingly Asian Americans, but also Hispanics, that's come across in great detail, and also young black men are pivoting to the right in greater numbers, but actually we see other groups pivoting to the left. So for me, this is we shouldn't be too parochial about it and not be too British centric. Actually, this kind of unexpected consequence of diversity is happening everywhere, and I don't think policymakers have grappled with it fully.
Zayn, do you want to say anything about Canada?
Sure, yeah. I mean, there was around 2011, there was a significant effort by the Canadian Conservatives to try and reach out to ethnic minority voters, particularly Indian and Chinese, on the grounds that these voters were thought to be natural conservatives in that they were economically affluent and somewhat socially conservative. Moreover, they were located in really key battlegrounds in the suburbs of Toronto and Vancouver, and the Conservatives have had some success with that. And I think sort of obviously one of the keys to that is the party has to show that it has it's distanced itself from perceptions of xenophobia, which is something that, for instance, the Republicans in the US have struggled with, why they have been less successful, I think, at reaching out to ethnic minority voters. And the Conservatives in Canada have had some success with that. The other, I think, dynamic in that sort of is that the extent to which some minority groups see another party as the representatives of a particular minority group, right? So, for instance, there might be a perception amongst Indian conservatives in Canada that the Liberals are the party of Muslims. So that might be something which further drives might further drive the Indian conservatives or Chinese voters to the Conservatives in Canada. And you probably see some of that dynamic going on in the UK as well, where there might be a perception amongst Hindu voters that Labour is the party of Muslims or gives preferential treatment to Muslims.
That's really interesting. Actually, just coming back to your point, to any of you, really, I mean, it's one of the things that strikes me about the Rishi Sunak, Lee Anderson thing is that sustainable? I mean, they're so different and they're coming from such different places. Is that just creating a coalition that's bound to fall apart?
No one wants to take the tricky hospital pass question. Look, I think that question also stands for Labour as well. It's the same thing, which is that why are centre-left and centre-right coalitions inherently unstable? I mean, the case for that is pretty strong, which is that both parties in the UK have risen and collapsed in quick succession, and that's set to continue. So Labour have seemed to have risen to stratospheric 45% polling, 2 months out from the election. And I think pollsters now have them on as little as 29%. So that volatility, that's one of the features of the volatility. But in defence of the Labour Party and the Conservative Party, those kind of what we call awkward coalitions make sense because there's a clear landing zone in terms of economics, which is that very clearly the minorities that shift to the right and the non-minorities that do, there is a vision there for the country about a smarter, smaller state where private enterprise, capital, home ownership, and traditional values and the emphasis on, for example, living a conservative life. There's a very clear overlap there, and I think the same is true of the left in terms of the economic views that people have over the role of the state, the role of welfare. I think where it's becoming undone is on social issues. So the report makes very clear that amongst minorities, the culture wars don't really operate in the same way. So, for example, all minorities are more pro-migration, but not necessarily uncontrolled migration, and are also more pro-multiculturalism. And usually those two views walk in lockstep with levels of social authoritarianism amongst the white population. But that turns out not to be the case amongst minorities. So I think, one of the big features of the report, we talked about how minorities are fragmented everywhere, and you can't really synthesize or parse what they think and mean. But actually, on those issues, on the culture war is basically something that is being operated almost entirely amongst white voters, and actually. Minorities are, to a degree, not post-materialist. Their concern is about getting ahead in life, getting on, going up the economic ladder, securing a degree of economic security for their children. And for me, that was, I think, the most striking thing, the findings of the report, which was just like what people want out of life is a bit different depending on whether you're a minority or not.
And this implies, I mean, any of you, I mean, Sophie, if you want, you take this one. We might have to sort of rethink how we think about social science. We might have to rethink some of our categorizations, because it turns out that actually we're basing them on things that might be true for white voters but aren't true for other voters. Is that fair?
I think it's one of those things. Can you hear me, Sam?
Yeah, there was a bit of a delay. Sorry. Oh, this is going well.
Zain, do you want to say? I think Zain can probably cover that.
Sure. I mean, just to sort of reiterate what James was suggesting, one thing we found that was, and this goes to the points about minorities not being post-materialists, as ethnic minorities get more affluent or richer, they become much less likely to vote for parties on the left than white voters who become who are more educated or more affluent, which is an indication that economics matter perhaps more for minority voters, and cultural issues are less salient.
Yeah.
I think just to kind of grapple with that, it's a big question, which is, do we need to start rethinking social science? I think a model that works for 85% of the public is still a pretty good one. So I don't think that this means tearing up the rule book. The other point I think that's being made here is that some minorities are beginning to vote and think in lockstep with the white population. In other words, Zain did some really good modelling, and we should get into it, which is basically, I know we like to be accessible here at UK and Changing Europe, but basically he did some logic modelling, which is basically some regression modelling that works out whether someone's ethnicity actually has an effect on whether they vote a particular way, or whether it's a function of other stuff, which we call confounds. And actually what you find is that minorities are really different. So some minorities, the fact that they are a minority from a particular group affects how they vote completely independently of all the other features of them. So Zain's modelling found that particularly acute amongst voters who were Muslim and voters who were black. That was very, very clear, that kind of independent of who these people were, where they lived, what their jobs were, how rich they were, there was a clear kind of intercept effect. That is not the case amongst some of the groups that now lean right. So really, the fact that they lean right is a function of other things that are not to do with their ethnicity. And I think that's really worth bearing in mind. What it means is you can't really junk the current social science model, because it's not like there's a complementary one for minorities to go along with it, because actually all the subgroups are operating on completely different pathways.
Yeah, no, that is interesting. Just to warn people ahead of time, it would appear that the Wi-Fi here at King's has decided to die in stages. So if Zain, Sophie, or I disappear at any point, then keep on going without us. We'll try and rejoin. I think Sophie's back on phone data now, tethered to her phone, but we'll do as well as we can. But let's just talk about the report and how it was done. What is so significant or so special about the data on which this report is based? Surely someone wants to take this.
Zain, why don't you do that first, and then I'll second.
Sure, I think, and James was getting at this, one is just the sample size, right? So we have a sample of close to 5,000 ethnic minorities, and typical BES post-election study will have perhaps 200 or 300 respondents. And the reason that's significant is the things we've been talking about just now about how the effects of education, income, age differ for minorities and white respondents. To do those types of interactions, you need large sample sizes. And so that's typically why you haven't been able to study these dynamics for minority populations in the past.
Okay, did either of you want to add anything?
Sophie, do you want to go, and then I'll add something to that.
I think James, obviously, him and Focal were the people who went out and gathered all this data, so they can definitely speak more to like the methodological side of it than I can. But I think, kind of just to echo what Zane said, it's one of those things where it's not because people don't want to study this subject or they don't find it interesting. It's certainly not that. And we've seen efforts to try and look at this type of stuff, as far back as 1997. So there's been efforts to do this type of thing before, but we've seen in how long it's taken us to write this report up. It's really time consuming. It takes a lot of effort. And it's really expensive. And so just quite often pollsters, social scientists don't have the time, the resources, the staff resources, and in terms of expense, I think, to do projects like this. And so I think what James can probably elaborate on a bit more as well is there's just not really the incentive for social scientists or pollsters often to do research like this.
Yeah, I think we're all in violent agreement, and Zayn and Sophie made some great points. I mean, I would make a couple of other drier points from a data collection perspective, which is the final data set was around 4,000, but actually that was trimmed from a wider group of people, who nearly 8,000 people. And there are a couple of key problems with trying to survey ethnic minorities, and actually the trickiest is what we call geodemographics. So, just to unpack that for listeners who have a normal day job and don't study geodemographics, basically it's where minorities live that polling goes the most wrong. So a lot of on online, particularly online panels, as opposed to random probability samples or phone polling, is that a lot of the ethnic minorities who are interviewed in surveys don't tend to be from the right postcodes. They're not from the right areas. Online polling struggles with basically surveying people who grow up and live in communities that are actually not heterogeneous but quite homogenous and very ethnic minority heavy. Those communities are not sampled very well. And you would have seen this at the recent general election, where a lot of the most incorrect forecasts were not just in the most ethnically diverse areas, but actually in the areas where the number of non-white people was extremely high, and there were actually a distinct lack of people who were white. So that was a challenge, and we had to basically overcome that with a sampling strategy that was extremely detailed. We spent more than half a year going through that. But just to alight on what Sophie said about social incentives, which I think is a great academic and euphemistic way to describe basically what we're studying is quite controversial, is pretty easily misunderstood and very easily misrepresented. And actually some of the findings, which we haven't yet talked about, are quite controversial and pose a lot of questions about integration and assimilation and British values. We find that certain minority groups hold views that are potentially a bit distasteful, particularly around anti-LGBTQ plus attitudes, but there are others as well in the report. And we basically don't shy away from that. I think Sophie, Zane, Anand and myself, and we shouldn't forget there were lots of people who contributed to this. Paula Surridge, I think, is one in particular. We basically didn't shy away from it. We said, if it's there in the data, we're going to report it. It's very clear. We didn't amend any of the questions that we asked. We didn't pull any punches, and it's there for everyone to kind of see.
Okay, thank you. We've got a question from Dan Beck, which is, were people of mixed ethnicity sampled? I think the answer is yes, but do you want to just mention those people briefly, whether they've got distinct views?
They were sampled, and one thing I do recall from that is they tended to be actually quite socially liberal and amongst the most socially liberal groups in the population. I don't know if there's other aspects of that Sophie or James want to highlight.
Sophie, what were you going to say?
So I think it's one of the groups that probably, of all the ethnic minority groups, votes most kind of in line with their social and economic preferences. I think of any of the ones that we look at. I mean, one of the themes that we talk about in the report is like amongst some ethnic minority groups, there's kind of this disjunction between their actual preferences and their voting patterns. I.e. they're quite socially conservative, but they consistently vote for parties to the left. And I think mixed race voters as kind of non-distinct in some ways as that category is. We tend to consistently see that they hold, I think, more economically and socially kind of liberal left-wing preferences, and so their voting patterns, as in a strong support for the Labour Party, kind of makes more rational sense than maybe the voting patterns of some other groups.
All right,
Yeah, I think we got a lot of questions on our event on mixed race people because it's the largest growing group, basically, I think, in the census. But a couple of things to note from a pure numbers perspective. It's still proportionally quite a small group. I think it's around 3% in England and Wales, which is a percent lower than the number of black people and is less than, the number of Asian people is more than 3 times the size. But also as a group, it obviously consists of many different subgroups. And what we find is that each of the subgroups are very different. And even with our large sample, we had to be very careful about drawing conclusions about this particular group. The other thing is, when analysing respondents who are mixed race, the number of confounds are enormous. So where they live is very, very accentuated by demographics. So it's very sharply correlated to income levels and density levels. And what we find is it broadly tracks affluent inner city areas that are very kind of politically skewed. So it's quite hard to separate that out as a confound versus their views.
I mean, one question we've had from a few people in various different forms is essentially to what, I mean, you have to think beyond the confines of the report for this, I think, to what extent the greater diversity of the Parliamentary Conservative Party has contributed to the tendency of some ethnic minority groups to lean towards them more. Has that made a difference? Any of you have a hunch?
I can talk about that a little bit. I'll try to anyway. I mean, I think it probably has to an extent, but I think it's worth pointing out that one of the things that we see when we ask people about what they want from politicians and parties in this survey and in this report is like not many of them really prioritize having people who look like them, are from the same background in terms of ethnic background as them, is something that's particularly important, or at least not relative to, overall things of like competence, ability, share the same priorities and values and so on. Has that potentially declined in time as both parties have become increasingly diverse? So there's not necessarily a stronger distinction, and it doesn't have to be something that a voter makes like a conscious choice about. I'm sure it has, but in terms of, is it the thing that's still tipping voters over the edge? I'm not necessarily sure that it is, or it's certainly not top priority for many ethnic minority voters, I don't think. And I mean, we tend to just see that ethnic minority voters overall have warmer opinions of all politicians and all parties than white voters too, regardless if they're from the same ethnic background or just another ethnic minority background overall. So I don't think we can really draw anything out that distinctly from the data we've got necessarily.
Zane or James? Anything to add on that?
No, I think Sophie covered it well. I don't think it makes a huge amount of difference. I think the one exception to that, probably Sophie, is the unlocking of the Hindu vote. But I think that's much more, there's been a long-term shift in the British Indian Hindu vote that precedes Rishi Sunak's ascent to becoming Prime Minister. And it's sped up, I think, you would say, with his arrival. But a lot of that is to do with demographics, foreign policy, representation, what's happening at the local level. For me, I think what would matter more is probably local councillors. I mean, if you just look on, for those of you that Google or research who local councillors are across Britain, I think it's just quite interesting that the diversification on the right isn't just necessarily an elite diversification. It's happening at a very local level. And I think that will be transformative, but over a very slow period of time. I don't think it's as simple as people following other people who match their demographic bracket.
Okay, we've kicked off a slight flurry of interest in the sort of comparative dimension by our earlier discussion of Canada and touching on the US. And I don't know if any of you want to have a try at this, but Are the attitudes of minorities in the UK similar to those in terms of social and political beliefs in, say, the US or Canada or Europe? And I know you've been doing some polling in the US, James. I don't know if you want to have a stab at this. We're going well beyond our reporting.
That's a massive question. I'm
Yeah.
very interested to know who asked that.
Anonymous.
Let's not anonymous. Okay, cool. Someone sat at the back of UK and Changing Europe, mixing things up.
Emmy.
So let me just compare for the minute the US with the UK. I think the main thing that we see, and actually we haven't mentioned, which is very important about the report, is cohort matters. Like where people are from and at what period of time and what country deeply matters for the views that they hold. It's very predictive. And a really good example for that would be the difference in public opinion between British Muslims and American Muslims, where there is what I would call a kind of public opinion chasm, basically. And I don't think people really understand that when they go through the data. I think there's a lot of assumptions that minorities kind of vote the same way across different democracies. From what we can see in the data, the skew in minority opinion amongst different democracies is very correlated to levels of higher education, but also where people live. And it's very hard to extract as a confound how urban and dense an area is from the skew that minority opinion has. And the really interesting thing that you can see really is what happens in more rural communities, because that gives you, as it were, a much more effective way of being able to compare the samples. My view is that increasing levels of centre-right representation amongst minority groups is having an effect of racially depolarising electorates across the world. But what that means is we're continuing to divide on educational lines. So what it really means is that this big shift between left and right will continue to be a kind of education divide. And for me, the biggest difference between the US and the UK is that the US educational divide is increasing and steepening. And you're going to see this at the recent elections. So in the 2024 results, we've got the number of young black men, particularly if they don't have a college education, going to come out, probably according to the polls, in the greatest numbers they've ever done for the Republicans. But a lot of that is basically an education effect. And the racial depolarization is a function of that. Whereas I think what's going on in the UK is a bit different. Zane can talk very comfortably about Canada, and he was referencing areas like Brampton in Toronto, which is a suburb, has a very high ethnic minority population. Canadians are just much more flexible and volatile. So basically, if you look at any public opinion poll in Canada, and you say which of the parties would you potentially vote for, Canadians are really flexible. And instead of that being volatile, that's just political openness. So at any point in time, most Canadians are open to voting for 2, 3, or 4 of the parties. That's not necessarily the case here, where a lot of British people know which of the parties they don't want to vote for. So to kind of summarize, I think basically the dynamics are a little bit different in each of those countries. And I think in Australia, the voice referendum that occurred last year, for me, that's the most interesting, but I'll let the others kind of take my lead on this and develop the argument further.
Zane, do you want to add something on Canada?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think in recent years, you've seen a movement amongst ethnic minorities to the Conservatives, in particular, surrounding issues around sort of quote unquote woke issues, so in particular issues about sex education in schools, transgender rights. The Conservatives in Canada under the current leadership have tried to make that an effort to mobilize ethnic minorities towards the Conservatives, and there is some success or some evidence of that. And yeah, I completely agree with James that, you know, in Canada you have much higher levels of electoral volatility, partisanship is much lower, and that sort of provides maybe an opportunity for parties to appeal to ethnic minority voters in a more flexible way. And again, a lot of the sort of domination of the ethnic minority vote historically amongst the Liberals in Canada was Liberals were seen as the party of open immigration. That a lot of people immigrants came to Canada when the Liberals were into power. Now that's sort of changing. There's a public backlash towards immigration in Canada, particularly surrounding issues around housing, the effect of housing, and minority voters are also minority voters are also less supportive of immigration in Canada now than they were in the past, which is also something we find, I think, in the UK, that ethnic minorities are becoming more opposed to increasing immigration than they were in recent years.
Okay, interesting. We've touched on this, but we've got a couple of questions about it, so I'll pick it up again, which is, we've talked about trends where some groups seem to be drifting towards one party or another, but do you have data that identifies the reasons why they're doing this? So why are some ethnic minorities leaning toward the Conservative? A particular set of policies? What are the specific reasons in policy terms, if there are any?
I think that's the wrong question, Anand. Which is
Okay.
I don't think that long-term structural shifts occur because of it's been unlocked by a policy. I think
Right.
what we're seeing is very consistent with the evidence about what's happened with white voters, which is that eventually historical memory of why certain groups and vote for certain people fade, and actually their demographics and the features of their life take over. And so there's no longer block votes. So the story of our report is very similar to the findings of the Red Wall analysis. Like Sophie and Zane, in particular Zane's modelling, I think, really points out that a lot of these residual features of history are basically fading away. And that is a problem for both the centre left and the centre right. So the centre left for years benefited from the votes in the Red Wall, which were not contingent but block votes that were independent of demographics. That was then no longer the case in 2019, and now they're just marginal voters in marginal places. The same is likely to be true of ethnic minorities over the next 10 years. But the Conservatives have also had a block vote in the south of England for many, many years, completely independent of the demographics of an area. And that is actually starting to erode with big electoral consequences. So I think the findings of the report are basically very consistent, which is that history is starting to fade, like big structural events that changed how groups of people vote are eroding, and instead their individual level markers are starting to dominate.
If you want to add anything? Zane? No?
Yeah, just one thing that while I think there still is this residual of, while minorities might have policy preferences which align with the Conservatives, there might still be reasons they are still not voting for them. So, for instance, one thing we found was that at high levels of positive views towards the Conservatives, even when you control for other confounders, whites are 15 to 20% more likely to vote Conservative than ethnic minorities. And these are amongst those who give the Conservatives a high sort of favorability rating. So there is still something amongst many minorities. So even while they have a favorable view of the Conservatives, they might be somewhat reluctant to vote for them.
Now, the bulk of the report is based on a survey that was carried out quite a way before the general election, supplemented by a bit of data from the general election. But I suppose one question that hangs around all this is to what extent in the recent election do you think we see signs of big changes to come in? Can you just talk us through some of the big results in this election that point to some of the phenomena that we see mentioned in the report? Does that make sense? I phrased that appallingly badly. Sophie,
So I think we see.
Sorry,
Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah, sorry.
Okay, I was panicking a little bit then again that my internet had gone. I think this election is a bit of a weird one to talk about in terms of all the changes that we talk about in this report, because the Conservatives lost so badly and amongst so many voters in this most recent election that it kind of dilutes a lot of the trends that we talk about. They're actually much more apparent in 2019 and the data we have from that election than the most recent one. But at the same time, if you look at kind of the demographic breakdown that we have, I think in the first section of the report, you can see that, okay, the Tories lost support amongst pretty much every demographic, but that was much more limited amongst some groups, or Labour's gains were much more limited amongst some groups than others. So if you look at British Asians, Labour were up only a very small percentage amongst that group compared to, say, amongst Black voters in the way that we segment them. So you can kind of see those movements, albeit not to the same extent as 2019. You can see them a little bit. And I think what's really interesting is probably the biggest story in terms of ethnic minority voters at this election was obviously Labour's loss of support amongst British Muslims, non-white British Muslims. And obviously that produced, I think, the most surprising result, but a lot of that was kind of mobilised by a very specific issue, i.e. Gaza and Labour's response to that, and how it's dealt with that issue. And I think what will be interesting at the next election is seeing how much of that anger continues if that conflict is no longer as prominent an issue. Because what our data suggests is that actually if voters, our data suggests, non-ethnic minority voters vote according to their economic preferences. British Muslims might be quite socially conservative, but they're actually quite economically liberal. So if they continue voting in line with those preferences and Gaza is no longer as big of an issue in voters' minds at the next election, they should move back towards the Labour Party or at least other parties of the left anyway. So I think it's kind of two stories of shifts that we think might be more temporary or more sort of circumstantial, and those more longer term shifts which might have been diluted this time around, but we still see some evidence of them.
James or Zane, anything to add on interesting trends that we saw from the election?
Well, I think there's maybe two other micro trends. The first is obviously the Harrow East being the safest Conservative seat in the country was not on anyone's bingo cards, and I think was a huge kind of shock, and it is potentially a measure of quite how far the British Hindu vote has yet to go in terms of drifting right. But I think Labour did very well in a lot of South London, and I think that's slightly hidden by their disappointing overall vote share for a party that has 174 seat majority, but actually around bits of Lambeth and Southwark, huge redoubts of centre-left support, which could grow further. And I think that's worth kind of acknowledging and understanding that. But for me, going forward, there's a couple of things that are going to be really interesting. The first is at the local level. I'm fascinated to see how this fragmentation operates at the level of council elections and ward elections and what that looks like in terms of representatives. And whether we might start to see more centre-right representation in council elections that typically favour the person who's the opposition, not the incumbent. The second thing I'm quite interested in is the politics of London, and whether they start to shift in ways that are very complex in terms of the relationship of voting intention to ethnicity. Labour have made a lot of gains amongst certain degrees of white voters, particularly those who are above a kind of average level income, and particularly if they have a university level education. I think the politics of London might start to change, and I think that's going to be really interesting. There's there'll be mayoralty elections coming up. There'll be other local elections. I think poll watchers and analysts should really be paying attention to what's going on there.
Can you just be more explicit when you say the politics of London might be changing? In what particular direction do you think?
Well, look, for years, the most efficient way to model the centre-left vote was basically to take the number of minorities that exist in every area by ward or by even small as an MSOA, if you want to go that far, and then basically model that versus density levels and housing tenure. And the kind of right-left vote was basically operated on a housing tenure and ethnicity line, basically. And Brexit somewhat changed that so that there was then an educational divide as well. I'm very interested to see whether there's a degree of racial depolarisation in London, or whether it starts to fragment that relationship to ethnic diversity and voting labour, and not because London is the most diverse city of the UK. If it does,
right.
Well, everyone's talked about Harrow East, but Hendon, I think, was only Labour by 15 votes, which was, again, another big shock. And I don't think Hendon has a particularly sizable Muslim community either, so that can't be put down to a massive collapse of the Labour vote. And I think for me, I think London might be at the beginnings of a bit of a shift in terms of its politics, and not necessarily to the right, by the way, but in terms of who is voting right and where they are located.
Okay. Zane, did you have anything to add?
Just perhaps even one note of optimism for the Conservatives is that when we asked why people didn't vote Conservatives, minorities were not, they weren't not voting Conservative because they saw the Conservatives as the party of right-wing nationalism. The reason they weren't voting Conservatives were sort of more, ephemeral specific issues such as Partygate, handling of the economy, etc. So it's not that that a large section of minority voters are completely out of reach for the Conservatives because they are conservative, because these voters see the Conservatives as sort of racist or just the party of white nationalism. So I thought that was quite interesting.
Yeah, I
Okay, and
mean,
one of
look,
the go on.
just to add to that, and just be really blunt, there's a leadership election going on, and the favourite, I think, in the polling, which is Kemi Badenoch, to win the election. I mean, she is black. She's of West African extraction, and the idea that this won't have any import, I think, is not that credible. And I think it's going to be a really interesting time for political scientists and pollsters to really understand what is this going to do to our politics. It might affect nothing,
Hmm.
but it might not, because what we saw is that the anti-conservative vote, which is still very high amongst minorities, is quite contingent. It's quite context specific, and I think we might be at the beginning of a bit of tectonic plates shifting amongst some communities, but not others.
And it's worth saying that one of the implications of something that Sophie said earlier about a lot of the detail being drowned out by the sheer scale of the Conservative defeat this time is, if you have closer elections or elections where you don't have this sort of scale of swing, these issues are going to become far more important to overall electoral outcomes, aren't they? Just nod then. Don't come back with anything substantive. That's fine. Thanks very much. Right. There are loads of people who want to dig in a little bit into this issue of the way in which education is making some minority voters shift right, whereas it's making white voters shift left. Can you dig into this a little bit more? What's going on? Why is it going on? And James has touched on the fact that this is not just a UK phenomenon, but why do we think it might be happening? You're very keen, you lot.
Can I volunteer, Sophie?
Sophie's losing her voice, so if it goes
Okay.
halfway through, then
Okay, I think that's worth explaining to respondents rather than Zane or I taking the majority of the questions. Sophie's losing her voice, so
Sorry.
I'll take this as to why we think this is happening. So what we didn't ask in terms of university education was what people hoped for their long-term careers. And I
yeah,
think if you look at the career pathways and what the hopes are for people, minorities and white people are very far apart. So we had a question which we didn't include in the final report. I think it was scrubbed, which I think Sophie's going to write a blog about, which is about what people's hopes are for their children. And for me, the funniest bit of polling was that white people show a massive predilection for wanting their children to be happy, which was simply not the case amongst minorities to the same degree. They were much more concerned that their kids were successful and got ahead in life. And I think some of the education effects don't operate the same way because the motivations are different. We didn't do a higher education survey, but I strongly hypothesize that basically if we were able to do that, you'd find that the motivations and pathways into higher education are basically quite different between there are fewer ethnic minorities going on to do their dream course of X to kind of self-actualize. Many of them are going to university to get ahead in life and earn more than their parents and to become socially mobile. The second reason why I don't think the higher education dynamic works the same way. So first of all, we're not the first people to highlight this either. The thesis was Thomas Piketty's. It's actually the centre-left economist who's done a lot of work around inequality. And he observed it across almost every modern democracy. And I think one of the key things that's missing here is social mobility. So a lot of the minorities who are going to university may be the first or at least second generation of going to university. They're not, minorities are only a sneeze away from having not too much money, all coming with very few assets. The story is very different for a lot for white voters who suffer from a lot more downwardly socially mobile trends and patterns. And I think what we're picking up on with the education effect is actually a socially mobile effect. We're picking up on a huge cohort of people who are going to do better than their parents. And that is sadly not the case for a lot of white voters where for me, my biggest takeaway that we haven't really talked about is that a lot of white voters are quite a lot more pessimistic than ethnic minorities. Their life outcomes are getting worse, and their degree of social mobility, downward social mobility, is quite high, but they're quite post-materialist. And my main takeaway from the report was there's a crisis of confidence and a degree of value disjunction amongst a lot of the white population of the UK. And I think that will be addressed by other people in another report. But I think that would be my answer to that, Anand.
Okay, Zane, anything to add on that?
Yeah, no, I think James is absolutely right that there is amongst ethnic minorities perhaps a different view as to the role of education as sort of an economic ladder. The only other two things I would highlight is, and we just don't know this, and this is broader than our report, but the effects of the so-called liberalizing effects of education. Does it depend on actually also the content of what you study in university? So, for instance, is the effect of a STEM degree different than a liberal arts degree? The other thing I would suggest is perhaps maybe ethnic minorities attending higher education are also still more likely to live at home or less likely to go away for university, so that sort of socializing liberal network effect might be less prominent amongst them than white voters, or who tend to go away for university and get exposed to more sort of liberal networks in university.
I mean, it does seem to me there is a particular element of insecurity attached with being particularly a quite recent immigrant that shapes attitudes quite profoundly. But Sophie, do you want to croak something, or?
I just think one of the interesting things as well that I think is linked to education as well, and that amongst the ethnic minority population, that's not really in the white population, which I think ties to what James was talking about, was the income link as well, in that there is a much clearer link between income and university education attendance and the impact on your values, your economic preference, and so on amongst the non-white population than there is amongst the white population. That tie is much less clear, I think. And I think that really kind of sums up really that point James was making about the motivation for going into higher education maybe being different amongst the ethnic minority population, and that there seems to be a much clearer tie to that having kind of an income effect than we see amongst the white population in our data, which would maybe suggest a different professional career field or structure, so on. So that's kind of some preliminary evidence for that, I think.
I mean, I 100% agree with Sophie, and I think if we were to give this a story flavour, I think a lot about Richmond, London, and Harrow, and in particular bits of Brent as well. So Richmond is fascinating, right? Because it's actually a very particularly undiverse bit of London, but it's drifted systematically to the left at quite a rapid pace over the last 10, 15 years. It's also very white, and it's very rich, and it's very educated. And a lot of it's very interesting that obviously views about climate change, about activism, about things to do with social radicalism find quite strong expression in that part of London. It's also interesting though that Harrow and many of the kind of more racially diverse bits of London that have perhaps a higher Indian population or other ethnic groups, you've got quite high social mobility and increasing house prices, but for some reason the pathway to getting richer doesn't lead people to this degree of social liberalism. You don't find lots of Extinction Rebellion activists hanging out in Harrow, but you do in southwest London, right? And I think it's worth reflecting that there's something completely different going on with the life stages of social mobility, about getting on in life between white people and non-white people, and we live and see it every day, right? We experience it every day, and I think that's really worth understanding.
And actually, slightly related to that, it's something we haven't talked about, but it's something that I thought was absolutely fascinating, is we see differences over generations, don't we? whether you're a first, second, or third generation immigrant really makes a difference. Can someone just talk to that for a moment? Because I think this is really interesting. We're looking towards the future and what happens. Those attitudes shift. Who wants to?
And I think we can all probably take a slightly different bit of that, to be honest, because generation seems to work in different ways depending on the question that we're asking. So
Right.
something that really stuck out for me in terms of the generation split, pardon me, was the national identity questions that we asked in terms of what is it to be British and what's your perceptions of, the kind of boxes you need to check to be considered truly British is the way we phrase it in our questions. And I was quite struck by the fact that kind of earlier generations of ethnic minority respondents, so who are the first or the second generations of their families to live in the UK, are much more kind of focused on the idea of respect for national institutions, respect for law, respect for culture, and kind of like assimilation almost, I think, into kind of British culture and norms and institutions. But later generations, that seems to fade away. And actually, they seem to adopt a approach to what it is to be British that's actually more in line with what we see amongst the white population, which is much more, I think, maybe pragmatic is the way to describe it. So, literally, do you pay taxes, do you work here, do you have citizenship, then you tick those boxes and that's fine. So I think that's one way that it kind of manifests itself. That's quite interesting, but there's definitely other
Well,
ways that either Zane or
Sophie,
James can.
you've hit on an amazing theme that we should, given time, it's worth just reflecting on that the nation state is really important for first generation and second generation immigrants. Like many of them will have come from places where the nation state has failed them, and they've come to Britain in a way, either through push or pull, where there's a clear kind of hierarchy. Like there's a view that the British way is in many ways preferential to the system that they were under before. And that leads to a rise of a very different way of politics and way of doing things. And a lot of people talk, and you kind of mentioned slightly offhand, insecurity of first generation immigrants. But for many people, I think it's about a much clearer idea that the nation state is real, that kind of social relativism is less appropriate for first generation minorities. The idea that all, somewhat a political candidate mentioned that all cultures are not equal. If you're a first generation migrant, that is a completely uncontroversial statement because people's lived experience will tell you that. But it's very interesting amongst younger people, that is a potentially more controversial statement. So I think a lot of these trends may dissipate basically over time, which I think Sophie's pointing out. A lot of these ethnicity differences in 20 years time, we may just be sat here talking about ethnicity differences that don't really exist, and that bits of, being a British Indian Hindu is a bit like being a Huguenot and having a Huguenot surname. It signifies nothing other than a different surname. But that remains to be seen.
Yeah, I mean, when I refer to insecurity, I was sort of talking about the perceived fragility of the existence as a new immigrant, that everything feels a little bit more brittle, a little bit more conditional. And I think that, now I'm talking about sort of subjective experience of my parents rather than anything else, rather than the survey. But I think that is quite an important thing. But Zane, on this generational issue, is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think one of the most interesting things we found with the generational component was that sort of more recent generations are those who are the most likely to think that racial discrimination is a problem, that racism is a problem, even though I think we all agree sort of objectively over the last 40, 50 years, these things have gotten better. So maybe this speaks to an adaptive expectation or just higher social liberalism or less tolerance for racism amongst sort of younger generations. And sort of before we end, I do want to link that to another thing which I found really interesting in the report, was that perceptions of racial discrimination. We asked a battery of questions on, like, was racial discrimination an issue? Have race relations got better? And we found almost no support that was linked to vote choice. When we isolated all the other confounding variables, that had no effect on likelihood of voting for Labour or Conservative. I mean, that's not to say people don't think racism is an issue, but it's just not what's amongst minorities. It's not what's driving their vote.
And just to amplify that a little bit, what were the findings on whether people thought? I mean, can you summarize? Do you have? I'm not expecting you to have the numbers, but do people in general think racism is getting better or worse?
I mean, again, there's a massive generational difference, right? It's the younger generations are much more likely to think things are getting worse than the older generation. Yeah.
That's really interesting. We've got a great question here, again, sadly from Anonymous, who wants to know, I mean, there's no guarantee Anonymous is all the same person, I suppose. Which of the findings took you most by surprise? Most challenged what you'd expected to find? I like questions like this.
I'm very clear on that. I think it was the
Well,
finding
no,
on British Sikhs
yeah,
having very strong residual ties to Labour. I mean, that would be of no surprise to the 11 Sikh Labour MPs that were elected, I think, in the recent parliament. But I think a lot of people have talked about the Hindu-Muslim, effective divergence as a function of growing sectarianism and the role of foreign policy. And there's been a lot of discussion about that. I think British Sikhs get slightly left out of this conversation a little bit, which is that they're residually still very strongly for Labour, even if they live in very similar communities and areas to British Hindus or British Muslims. They were the loyalist group basically for Labour, and for me that took me by surprise. That maybe through lack of knowledge or experience, but for me that was very striking.
and they're quite left-wing on the economics and quite socially liberal, aren't they? From what I remember.
In part, but I would say just centre left. I think
Right.
didn't quite explain the vote share aspect of it.
Okay. So, Sophie, I'll let you go last so you can, practice speaking with your voice. Zane, what took you by surprise most from the report?
I mean, I think one would be just the finding I highlighted, the sort of complete absence of effect on voting behavior of racial discrimination. We asked that in multiple different ways, and that's one of the main theories in the literature about why do ethnic minorities tend to overwhelmingly support parties on the left. It's the feeling that they are better combating racial discrimination, but this wasn't really driving their behavior. And then the other one, which I think we've highlighted quite extensively, is this differential effect of education and income for minorities versus white voters.
And Sophie.
I think something I found really interesting was the influence of religion. Actually, I think just because when we talk about politics here and voting, I think generally it's something that we just, as an assumption, don't even really look into the influence to, because we tend to, I think, voting is so secular um here now. And I think what was really interesting was not just the fact that the ethnic minority community is so much more religious, and that actually the influence of religion is more enduring, in that I mean that younger ethnic minorities and later generations of ethnic minorities consistently say that religion is important to them, that they see themselves as part of a religious community, and that actually doesn't dilute over time. I think that's interesting in itself, but then also the influence that it has upon voting patterns, in that we see that actually it's some of the groups who are and this is ethnic minorities I'm talking about, who are most likely to say they're religious, that who are most likely to say that's an important part of their lives, and who are actually voting for Labour the most strongly. So not only is kind of religiosity more important overall, but the direction that influences voting behaviour in is very different amongst the ethnic minority population than it is amongst the white population. I just thought that distinction was really interesting.
Do you want to hazard a guess as to why? Or is that going above and beyond?
As in like why it works.
Why it works in a different direction?
I don't really know. I mean, from the data we've got, it seems to be that the groups who are most religious and it's most important to them also tend to have the most left-wing economic preferences as well. So what direction that relationship works in, I'm not really sure, but to me, I would assume those two things are linked, because it seems to be quite a consistent pattern we see across them.
Yeah, I mean, I also would have assumed that religiosity would have decreased with the generations, so I found that really surprising. I still actually can't quite wrap my head around it. You got any thoughts on this religious question, James?
No.
We're about to run out of time, so well, listen. Thank you all for joining us. We're a minute short, so we're going to draw it to a close there rather than being late, because I always get told off for being late finishing these things. But let me just say a couple of things. Firstly, please do download the report. The link is in the Slido chat. It is far, far richer, denser, more informative, even than this conversation would lead you to believe. There's an awful lot in there. And thank you very, very much for joining us. Our next lunch hour, I think, is in a fortnight's time. So until then, thanks so much. Have a good day and see you.